President Bukele of El Salvador sees an open net. There's an open net. There's a minute to go. And everyone around the world has pulled their goalie out, the goalie of freedom and democracy. And Bukele's saying, oh my God, there's an empty net. So he's taking that shot of freedom and democracy and shooting at the open net. And as a result, people are migrating to El Salvador and his economy is booming. Okay, so put that in your maple syrup and try to understand what I'm saying.
All I know is I've been to one hockey game and I went with Max and I said, Max, this is way too violent. This is like a very aggressive game.
That was nothing. That was nothing. Good Canadian style hockey, as Don Cherry recommends. That's what you need to get back to. Man, the day they took Don Cherry off the Canadian Broadcasting Network, that's the day Canada basically died. Anyway, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, much more coming your way. Welcome back to the Kaiser Report. I'm Max Kaiser. Time now to turn to Nomi Prinz, author of many classic books about markets, finance, central banks, and the corruption therein. She's going to be out with a new book in October called Permanent Distortion. Nomi, welcome back.
Thank you so much, Max.
Permanent Distortion, I think I can guess what it's about just from the title, which is great. Tell us, what is it about?
So as we know, because we have been talking about this for years, there is a disconnect, a massive gap between how the markets behave and between what people experience in their everyday real lives in the real economy. I, in this book, talk about how this is not a temporary phenomenon, but why it is permanent. This is where we're at. And what comes from this point is what gets both interesting and complicated. But the reality is, because of the boatloads of central bank money that has been fabricated out of absolutely nothing after the financial crisis of 2008, the pandemic in 2020, we are at a position in the world where the deluge of all of this has only jet propulsioned up asset prices, financial markets, and left the economy behind. And that has
Yeah, absolutely. I think that happened in the 90s, right? A lot of the GPU vendors, even with the consoles, no one was really sure how to do 3D. It definitely didn't look like the paradigm we have now, where you send most of it to the GPU, and the GPU handles the triangles and the models and textures and everything. If you look at some of the early 3D consoles, it was like, well, do we do our vector calculations over here on the CPU? Do we pass them over to that DSP processor? Like, people were just experimenting. No one knew what the best approach was until a certain approach caught traction, and everyone went, yeah, this kind of makes sense. This is easy to develop for. The hardware exists, and then it took momentum. And then you also have to develop the standards and the APIs to support it, right? So OpenGL and DirectX had to become widely supported for that 3D paradigm to get there. I mean, we saw that with ray tracing early on. NVIDIA kind of pushed their RTX, and it was kind of like pseudo-supported through DirectX. And now DirectX supports ray tracing a lot more formally.
And now a
lot more agnostically.
Now we have DirectX 12 actually being used. Like, what was that, a decade ago we were starting to talk about it or something silly? Yeah. But let me move forward here. Mars Lazarus writes in, he says, hello, Tom and Matt. Is there any news regarding FSR 2.0 and or XE super sampling? How do you expect them to stack up against DLSS 2.0 or 2. Whatever? He says 2.x or whatever they call it, whether it's 3.0 or whatever. And do you think one of them will become the standard by virtue of being open source and vendor agnostic? So I think we'll just have to wait to see what Intel does. We don't really know how well it will pan out. Looks impressive in the videos they show, but I don't know. For FSR, though, we've mostly been talking about DLSS. Like, do you have any thoughts on how FSR works and where AMD can go with FSR 2.0 to make? Because I think that's the wild card. We talk about how I talk about in my Lovelace leak that I think it's very obvious. As long as NVIDIA is within 20% of the performance of top RDNA 3, they can then just try to leverage a new version of DLSS and really spend the money to put it into every single game on PC and say, whatever, we're better with DLSS and it works now. Like, I think the wild card is if FSR is every bit as good as that. Like, what do you think about FSR, and where do you think it might go to maybe make it so they really do keep an advantage over Lovelace?
So to me, the biggest distinction between DLSS and FSR is that DLSS will add information to a frame.
I think you're going to be happy with that.
The neural net decides, these certain higher resolution features need to be here. That'll kind of insert them with some error, but it inserts new information to the scene. FSR does not, in its current form at least. And
I think you're going to be
FSR
happy with
is
that.
kind of, there's information about this scene and it's at the wrong resolution, and it's more about how do you present it in a way that doesn't just make it look worse. Right? It's that whole thing of anytime you have to change your resolution on your monitors to something sub-native, it just looks like crap. Whether it's because the scaling algorithm NVIDIA or AMD uses wasn't that good, or actually it kind of depends. Like, there's a lot of...
It depends on the game, too. Some of them, they look great. Some of them, it's like,
Right, so it depends on the game. Sometimes, I know Windows used to do this. You would set the resolution lower, and you can choose whether the scaler in your monitor does the downscaling or that your GPU does it. A lot of these monitors, the scaler algorithm is it's meant to be cheap and quick. And so it looks bad, and the colors get washed out, and it just looks awful. If you were smart enough to switch it over to GPU scaling, probably had a better experience, but still doesn't look great. But FSR was kind of the area where it said, hey, let's solve that problem. How do we take this lower resolution image where all the samples aren't necessarily lined up to the output resolution you want? How do we kind of interpolate that information and display it in such a way and add sharpening and here and there, and a little bit of an artist's touch to the final output, and give you something that doesn't just look destroyed by the scaling process. To me, I wish we had FSR years ago, and from a technological...
Right. It's
from a
almost different than
technological
DLSS
standpoint,
that way, right? Like, it allows you to just not have to lower resolution, but just you run the native and turn on FSR instead of downscaling.
Right, and so to me, yeah, it's kind of a tragedy. I wish we had something like this years and years ago in PC gaming. And from a technological standpoint, it being a post-processing type filter, there's no reason we couldn't have. There's no one really paid attention to that problem. So going forward, so that's kind of technologically the big distinction between the two is DLSS adds information, FSR doesn't, but it presents it in a better way. And going forward, I think AMD maybe got itself into a little bit of a marketing pickle, because everyone was expecting FSR, at least initially, to be the DLSS competitor. And I think they also expected it to be the competitor technologically, not just from a utility standpoint. They kind of serve the same purpose from a utility standpoint. You get more performance,
Right.
and it still looks pretty good. That's kind of the end result.
Which
for
I want to be
consumer.
clear and save us from people in the comments. I know they're not the same thing.
Right.
But and you put it much more eloquently than I have in the past. From a utility standpoint, though, they kind of are. Come on, guys.
Yeah. From the consumer's point of view of just, hey, my game's not running as well as I want it to, and I need to do something to get it to run better and not look as bad. That they serve the same purpose. Technologically, they're quite a bit different. So I think for FSR 2.0 to be competitive, AMD needs some kind of neural net or machine learning system to compete with DLSS on that same technological level. Whether they call that FSR 2.0 or give it some new name, I think that's up to them. I think it might cause some confusion, potentially. Marketing always tends to cause a lot of confusion. So I'm curious. I don't see these image scaling methods going away, whether that's NVIDIA image scaling, FSR. I'm sure Intel will have some version of it, or just use FSR since it's open. but they're all going to start competing on, I think, this machine learning front, and I think AMD is pretty really they're late to the game on that by a lot.
But you think they have to add some kind of trained component of that algorithm?
I think eventually, yes. Yeah, that's kind of the writing on the wall, and kind of, I guess, our discussion leading up to this point of machine learning methods and rendering and the utility of just getting a picture on screen that the user says, yeah, this is what I want, whether it's has errors in it or not.
Let me ask you this: do you think there's something they can do? It's something I've had suggested, or I don't know if it's even been suggested so much as I've kind of assumed it, like that AMD can do to kind of accelerate how efficient FSR is specifically for their architecture. Is there anything you believe they can do in the actual hardware to do that? Or do you believe it's all software and that's why FSR typically runs better on a Radeon card than a Pascal?
I think you can do it because I mean, from what I understand of it, it just runs on, it's a post-process filter. And so I think it basically just runs on the shaders. And the shaders are just little pieces of hardware that are programmable by the developer. So that's why it can run on everything.
But if it's built with one type of shaders in mind, it would be more efficient.
Yeah, so if AMD just built a block that took whatever frame buffer, passed it in there, and the logic of this block, its only purpose is to apply scaling, then yeah, you can get it done quickly and cheaply. But it's gonna be a die-space trade-off. It's the whole trade-off of do you want to do it in programmable logic blocks that might take a little bit longer to do it, take some energy to do it, or do you want to actually set aside die space and fixed function hardware to do it? Is it enough? Like, what is that engineering trade-off to them? Is kind of, I don't know what that block looks like,
right,
in terms of what that compromise is, in terms of what they would be willing to trade for it.
Well, and you want it to be perfect before you add that block too, right?
Right, yeah, you want to make sure it works. You want to make sure, you know, it accommodates all the different resolutions that you're interested in, but yeah, at some point it is a trade-off, and that's kind of where engineering and everything is. It's all compromises between solutions.
Don't you think we're getting to the point though where we're getting to such outrageous amounts of performance, to gigantic die sizes on super dense nodes, that you'd go, if we can use 10% of the die space to make FSR twice as efficient, so we're getting 50% higher frame rates or something, you think it'd be worth it?
Yeah, I would imagine these are all the questions these engineers are thinking about. Some of them might even be thinking of, I guess here's kind of devil's advocate to the point I made of AMD needs a neural net type upscaler. Is there's probably an alternate opinion somewhere existing that says, no, let's just keep pushing hard on just rasterization and ray tracing, and never trade that die space.
That's kind of what it almost sounds like to me too. I think with like little tweaks here and there so that FSR runs more efficiently, if you can do a little tweak to RDNA 3, but yes, in terms of the overall idea, I kind of think that's what they're leaning towards.
Yeah, so there's that ultimate argument, is that you imagine a world where it doesn't matter. You have enough gains in rasterization and ray tracing gen over gen that you don't care. Or maybe you have such good gains in rasterization and ray tracing, you just super sample or even subsample using FSR, and it looks good enough. Like, it's all different routes to the same end of in what manner do you add information, or in what manner do you get to this final render and present to the user. And you get in this complicated space of, do I just oversample? Do I add neural denoising? What are the different things I can get to? And at the end of the day, it's here's a picture at a certain frame rate to the user. And anyone who can make gains in efficiency to that output using any of those means, I think is going to be good, especially if it ends up easy for developers to get to. There's definitely something to be said about, let's just crank up the amount of sampling we can do and just use simple FSR where needed, because that's easy for developers. DLSS and those types of techniques take work to integrate into your engines. But just adding more samples and downscaling is really easy. So
yeah, I mean the amount of, and NVIDIA has the money, but the amount of effort that was needed to put in to have DLSS, the fact that comparatively so much less effort could make something like FSR, where we're even having the discussion that they're comparable. You can see the person at AMD, the engineer, going, look how much less we're spending to compete.
Yeah, the flip side of that is NVIDIA, they're not just putting tensor cores on their GPUs just for DLSS, right? They know that there's researchers out there doing machine learning research and a lot of workloads that benefit from having tensor cores. So for them, I think it's a little more important because they have that place in the market, whereas AMD doesn't have as cemented of an AI research type hardware pitch.
Well, and that kind of leads perfectly into this other thing I wanted to bring up earlier, but let's get to it now. Of like, I think there's NVIDIA, like you brought up, was ahead with Turing, so they knew they could start gambling on features that weren't just strictly really for gaming. I mean, even ray tracing wasn't really for gaming when it was first added to Turing. But I think in hindsight, you might argue they may have realized that image quality is getting to such a level that it might be worth focusing on the utility of a GPU, because I've seen every Ampere review focus on like the NVENC encoder and like non-gaming tasks. Chris Rich writes in and he goes, the transistor density of new chip manufacturing processes is still improving, but the cost per wafer is now increasing about as fast as it seems. And just to make it specific, like I know that the wafer cost for TSMC's 5 nanometers is about 70% higher per wafer compared to 7 nanometers. So 5 nanometers, 70% more for the same wafer compared to 7. And that means that even if you get 80% more density, you're practically just paying 1-to-1 for it. But he continues, in other words, the cost per transistor is only improving very slowly or perhaps not at all. Do you agree, and do you think end customers will need to adjust their expectations for new products? Would you expect the manufacturing side to change to mitigate this? And again, I think this is an important point, because I think they're realizing, I mean, if we can convince everyone they're, actually a pessimistic way would be to put it, if we can just convince everyone they're a creator, maybe they'll pay extra for the gaming card anyways. I do think that's a fair point, because it happened when Vega came out. I remember seeing a lot of fair points from NVIDIA fanboys in the WCCF Tech comments going, I didn't realize all AMD gamers were creators now.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a good point. In order for us to keep making gains of computational density, the process gets a lot more complex. That happens in every industry. In industry, it's the 80-20 rule, right?
Mm-hmm.
The last 20% of anything takes 80% of the energy and effort, and that's kind of the wall we've been slamming into with Moore's law for a while now. Is, hey, we can't just cut the feature size in half every year and have a new GPU generation every year, and everything just doubles and it's magical. We had that time period of technology, and it was both wonderful and bad, right? Because the
software was terrible
performance every year, but your stuff was obsolete in a year.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a little bit of benefit to stagnation, and I think you mentioned that a little bit about the 28 nanometer era of things were stable in terms of, as a commodity, how much computational power you needed, how accessible it was, how cheap it was, and you weren't really expecting things to move and leave you obsolete. So with graphics cards getting more and more expensive, it makes you wonder, are we going to settle on a level of performance that we say, yeah, it's good enough, and people who need more are just simply going to be the people willing to pay a lot more?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the ultimate player in this whole utility argument is ultimately be, what does Nintendo do with Switch 2 hardware? The whole rumor was it's going to be DLSS at the forefront. It's going to be some kind of chip that can do DLSS, and that's how they're going to reach their 4K target. At least that's the rumor. I don't know if you've heard. more than that.
Well, I had that
Yeah.
Switch 2 leak where I kind of talked about how the level of performance I expect, and of course, I just laugh when people ask me how much stronger will it be than the original Switch. It's like it's so weak. How do I even quantify how much stronger it is? Like it's gonna be like at least 10, 100. It's gonna be crazy stronger. I mean, we're talking about a 20 nanometer chip compared to what will be probably a 5 or 8 nanometer chip or something.
Yeah, and so I think the Switch is a good study point for this utility argument, because computationally it's nothing special.
Mm-hmm.
But it sells like hotcakes, and people like playing games on it. And I think Nintendo currently they don't want to just sell you a computer that plays games.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's their business model. I think at least with every console they've released, they try and do something special with it. So like the Wii was motion controls, and the DS had touch screens, and everything they release has some other aspect to it of how they're trying to entertain and engage with you. It's not just, it's got more power.
Mm-hmm.
So the manner at which the Switch 2, I think, approaches getting more visual fidelity is going to be telling about that utility argument, and telling about the costs associated with reaching that level of fidelity and newer process nodes. My thoughts are Nintendo's going to go with the leanest thing they can get away with. That's kind of been their
and maybe
MO for a
even
long
one
time.
step below what we would say that is, because they always seem to be just a little weaker
Right.
than even what I thought the minimum would be.
And if DLSS allows them to get there, that probably means from an energy standpoint and a rendering standpoint, that was the right trade-off to make.
Mm-hmm.
Which kind of cements this idea of this is probably the future of where real-time rendering is going. If Nintendo consciously with NVIDIA make the decision that the best way to get to the level of performance they want is to rely heavily on DLSS, and that allows them to get the chips cheaper and in the quantities that they want, then that's very good economically. And I, as a consumer, would be really interested in seeing what those results look like. Am I going to see a 4K Nintendo game that's just going to blow me away and going to be like, yeah, this is good, I'll play this?
Well, I'll say,
I want to see where it ends up.
In terms of raw performance, I'm expecting it. I'm trying to think of exactly how would I class this? Probably something. Oh God, I'm just trying to relate it to the other consoles. Probably something that's, plus minus 30%, which I know is a huge range, but there's a lot they can decide on and what die they go with in terms of the Series S. But then if you throw DLSS on top of that, I still have trouble believing it will easily run every game at a fake. Again, is it fake? It's not really fake, but it looks just as good. 4K 60. I think that's kind of where they're looking at, and so I don't know where you would class that. If that's good enough. Something around Xbox Series S, but with DLSS.
I think for Nintendo, it's good enough.
I agree,
And Nintendo is pretty smart. If they want to make a game 60 FPS, they adjust the art style to get there, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of and a lot of their games kind of lend to that. They don't go for ultra fidelity. A lot of times it's more cartoonish, that's the art style lends itself to easier rendering, I guess is the way I would put that.
My counter argument to that always, the art style argument is, yes, but Nintendo, if you just made it a little better, you could have every third-party game and make all that money too.
Right. So yeah, I also agree with that as well. They also lock out a bunch of really talented developers because the games simply can't run on their hardware.
If the Switch was, again, and I think I've covered this. I think they could have gone with Pascal. They could have actually gone with Volta even potentially, but instead they went with Maxwell after Volta was out. I just go, God, if you would have just given it 6 gigabytes of RAM instead of 3, and you would have just given it that little 50% performance bump, which probably, for being honest, would have cost $20. You could have run every third-party game.
Yeah,
for it.
In some alternate universe, there's a there's a version of Nintendo that doesn't underspec their systems, but
that pays $20 to double performance.
But yeah, that's a good good thing. This rising cost, commodity cost for essentially computers. Steam Deck, I think, is also another good product to study there, because it's coming in with a pretty modern APU, and we're still even just looking like, how well is this going to run things even at 720p with FSR?
Yeah.
You know, so that's the ballpark we're playing in. I would love to see what the SoC, the Loveless or whatever SoC Nintendo chooses for Switch 2, where it ends up in comparison to Switch or Steam Deck, and what it costs and just what developers can do with it.
So to bring it back to an earlier thing, I do want to ask this. Guntis Peglis writes, and he says, "Hello, Tom and Matt. What are your general thoughts on the subject of balancing performance and picture quality in gaming? Right now, we already have checkerboarding, DLSS, NIS, FSR, XE super sampling, and variable rate shading for things like upscaling, sharpening, and spending less shading resources in general on objects that just don't need it. Is there a new technology around the corner that could help selectively render the important parts of the frame in higher fidelity and the less important parts in lower, kind of like rendering in FP16 and then rendering maybe this other part of the frame in FP32?
Yeah, so I think that's right in line with what we've been talking about, of just where we think things are going. I think it would be cool to see futuristic engines and graphics pipelines that are totally aware of the complexity of the model they're trying to render and choose very economically where to sample. I think that would be amazing. Right now, it's just kind of everything gets uniformly sampled, as if it has the same importance to some extent. I mean, you mentioned developers do things where not all parts of the scene are rendered at the same resolution, but I mean even to an even greater degree than that, like to the point of certain pixels get super sampled. You know, but built from the ground up. Like these are all
just from the ground up a pipeline that it's not like we even market what it uses. It's just like it brings all these different things.
The whole time, yeah.
Yeah, which I think you see some. I've seen some kind of like first-party console devs play with this. You see, I think Epic playing with this in Unreal Engine 5, like this, almost like where they're like, well, we don't really worry about this. Like our whole pipeline is built to minimize this stuff.
Yeah, Unreal Engine 5 is a good example of that utility and final output, and how much information per pixel do you actually need. I think that was kind of their big push with their Unreal 5 engine demos and Nanite, where you can just feed it these monstrous high-resolution assets, and you don't have to think about doing level of detail scaling on it. It decides for you based on how far something is, or etc. It's gonna scale the fidelity of how it renders something to make it cheaper.
So then, to kind of directly answer his question, you think the next step is just the engine has their own cocktail that does all of this here and there, and then I guess maybe in NVIDIA drivers and AMD's Catalyst, we just have the option to force FSR or some version of DLSS, or maybe a some other, not, it wouldn't be DLSS if you forced it in a game because it kind of needs to be integrated, but like they make a version of it like FSR, and which I think they already are, by the way, and that's just an option in case this game is just kind of lazily put together on an old engine.
Yeah, so there's a lot to be said about what modern engines do for a developer in terms of optimizing those things, so you can focus on just making a game and not focus on how do I push it through the GPU efficiently. But I guess to answer the question more directly is I think we're already there in terms of, is there something around the corner that's going to selectively sample and make more efficient use of sampling? I think we're there. I think we're FSR and DLSS and Nanite and all of it, all these new techniques you're hearing about, that's it. It's I think it'll be a while for the dust to settle to kind of figure out what paradigm do we want to settle in terms of this more economical, efficient rendering, but I think we're there, and I'd like to see it pushed even further. As you were saying, at a hardware level, at a driver level, at the fundamentals of rendering. Is there a system that could intelligently make good sampling decisions based on the frame it thinks it has to render. We were kind of doing it now, but I think there's still a lot of
It's just kind of haphazard, ad hoc, and clumsy. We're not quite to where it's standardized and everything.
Yeah, we're kind of like at dynamic resolution, where the game drops from 4K to 1440p for this frame because it's heavy, but I imagine it even more like in a single frame the resolution varies.
In different parts of it.
It's like
foveated rendering.
Yeah, there's like nothing really going on in the sky, so it's sampled really sparsely, but the grass, there's a lot of detail, so we do a lot of sampling there, and just an engine being able to make those decisions in real time on a per frame basis in a way that's not uniformly sampled the way it is now. So I think we're getting to the point where we're already doing those kinds of things, and it's going to continue to get more baked in to the engines themselves and even into the rendering, and that's a cool place to be.
So I want to then move on. We've been talking for a while here. I've got like two more probably main subjects, but one I kind of want to touch on briefly first, or not briefly, depending on how much we have to talk about it, is FPGAs. That was something you said there was a lot you could speak about, and I think I'm just going to open this up to try to get right into it quickly. How do you see FPGAs being used with graphics cards, rendering, gaming moving forward? And this comes from, I remember 5 years ago, everyone was talking about ASICs constantly. You know, we're going to have an ASIC that does this, does that. And this is probably coming from an outsider, you know, less educated on the matter perspective. But now it just seems like people are talking about FPGAs far more than ASICs. Like, do you know what I mean by that? And like, how do you think this is going to intersect with gaming hardware?
So I don't have a lot of perspective of say people mentioning ASICs more than FPGAs. So I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about.
Well, at Hot Chips, I just remember looking at some older ones, a lot of presentations, and they're still there, right? And ASI, this isn't me saying, oh, we're not. No, we're using them all the time still.
Yeah.
It just seems like most of the headlines are like a new FPGA that does this one.
Yeah. So for those who are listening, if you don't know what an FPGA is, it stands for Field Programmable Gate Array. The easiest way to think about it is these are blank logic blocks. They're not really blank, but there's any digital circuit, you build it out of gates. These logic gates, they do AND gates, OR gates, NOT gates. If you take a digital logic class, that's kind of where you start. And you can build circuits out of these gates. So you want to build a circuit that adds 2 binary numbers. There's a configuration of gates that you put together, and it performs this function. And you build up these little pieces slowly, piece by piece, until you have a full functioning thing that you want, whatever digital function you want. So an FPGA is kind of this array that has a lot of these gates available, and when you program it, it changes the way they're connected together to achieve the function you want. So you don't, it's not like the CPU where you tell it what to do through programming and it moves your binary bits around to the gates that need to do those functions. The hardware itself actually rewires to do what you want to do. So when you program an FPGA, use something called a hardware descriptor language. It kind of looks like a programming language, but you're not describing what to do to the data. You're describing the hardware you want to exist. It actually, in practice, it ends up being a little bit of a mix of both, because just like in programming where there's a compiler for the hardware descriptor language. And you can tell the hardware descriptor language, like, I want these specific gates. I want 2 AND gates feeding into this OR gate, and the output goes here. So you can be very specific about how you want things wired. Or you can say, I just want this logic to be carried out, and it can figure out which gates to connect to do it for you. So there's a little bit of flexibility in terms of, I know exactly what I want, or just try and solve the easiest thing you can to achieve the result that I want. So where FPGAs are really useful one, if you're learning digital design, that's where you're going to start. So if you're designing digital circuits for any purpose, you're probably going to design them on an FPGA. Because not only are the gates rewirable, you can rewire the inputs and outputs. So if you need to connect it to other chips, you can connect it to other chips. So let's say Intel or somebody is prototyping a new block that's going to be on a chipset.
Right. That's how they do a lot of their R&D.
Yeah, or doing a chipset or something. Yeah, they can test what the performance and verify that it's going to do what they want to do by testing it on FPGA before committing to building a permanent version of it.
Which is tens of millions of dollars to make
Right.
a permanent version.
And so there's no difference between like Intel's final chipset and an ASIC. The ASIC is just a taped out version of what you
We're testing.
prototyped on the FPGA. You just decided that I'm done testing it and I want to build thousands, millions of them now. And so whether you choose an ASIC or an FPGA is really going to depend on what you need from an engineering standpoint. If you're prototyping something that you plan on making millions of, then yeah, you'll probably put an ASIC in every one of those devices at the end of the day. But kind of going back to the space payload stuff, satellite, for example, there's not a lot of missions where you're building more than one satellite for something. There's some exceptions like GPS or certain communication satellites where you're going to build hundreds of these things. Starlink is a good example. Then you want to go for an ASIC. But for a lot of these missions, these satellites are one-offs. So an FPGA is actually a good option because you get exactly the custom digital hardware that you want, and you only need it once. So in that case, the extra cost that an FPGA has per unit over an ASIC is fine. It's actually in your favor.
And so like this FPGAs, like this, the companies, there's a lot of companies I've been talking to, be honest, that specialize in them. This emergence of all these FPGA companies, it's a big deal because it kind of accelerates R&D then, is kind of what you're saying, and what you can do with one-off projects.
Yeah. So they're very useful. Another place they're used a lot is in communication systems. So anytime you need to generate or receive it and analyze it really quickly, so 5G communications, for example, is a good. FPGAs are great. A lot of FPGAs have PCI Express buses on them so that you can quickly transfer data. And for example, for communication systems, latency is a big deal. You don't want to spend a lot of time receiving data into a buffer, moving it to memory, pulling out of memory, having the CPU do its thing, push it back to another buffer, and then get it out the door. You want to do that as quick as possible. So with an FPGA, you can say, hey, pull this data right into the buffer, and then from the buffer, go right into the logic that does exactly what I want to do and nothing else. It has this one function, demodulate or apply this filter or do these computational tasks, do them quickly. It's kind of like that, for example, when we were talking about earlier, the FSR, whether you do it in shader model and do it on the shaders in a programmable fashion, or you build your own block to just do it quick and cheap. FPGAs like building that block where you just do it quick and cheap.
But the actual block will be more of like an ASIC.
Yeah, it would be an ASIC at the end of the day for something like FSR. But I'm just making that comparison of computationally. When you build a circuit, a digital circuit who has one function, it can do it really quick, and it can do it really energy efficiently. Maybe not the most die space efficient, but it does it quick. So in situations like communications where that's what you want low latency, and you want to do a lot of mathematical things, in this case modulation, demodulation, really quickly, FPGAs are great.
Yeah.
I am proud to say that Vite Ramen is a sponsor of Moore's Law is Dead. The Vite Ramen Company is an American company that pays its workers fair wages and engineered a tasty, healthy, and cheap meal that you can cook in less than 5 minutes. And these meals just got tastier with their updated version 3 of their ramen recipe. Meals aren't really healthy unless you keep coming back to eat the healthy ones, and that's what they've done with these. Click the link in the description and your money, and this supports.
So I'm going to jump in here because I think I have a good time to ask this question. Carbon Cry writes in and he says, given Matt, and he put it in quotes, if that is your real name, given Matt's experience with FPGAs, do you have any thoughts on the Xilinx AMD merger? Competitive positioning of Xilinx versus Altera? I hear Altera focuses on making programming an FPGA easier, while Xilinx seems to have gone the application store route. Is that the correct view in your opinion? And which approach do you feel is more desirable by the market?
When I first worked on FPGAs, they were Altera, and I think this was prior to Intel acquiring them. And my experience was positive. You know, their programming workflow and tools were really straightforward and easy to use. The latest project that I worked on with an FPGA, it's a Xilinx board. It's hard to comment on actually the quality of Xilinx's software because in that particular project, the stuff that's giving me trouble has nothing to do with Xilinx. It has to do with other hardware that I'm working with.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know that I can make a good comment on one approach versus the other. What I will say is I think what you might be referring to is a trend I've seen in other parts of the industry concerning engineering, prototyping hardware, and stuff like that, where there are a lot of companies that are leaning into kind of these turnkey solutions. So say you want to do compliance testing for DDR5. A company's going to sell you some suite of hardware that it's not just the hardware that enables that testing, it's going to be software and compliance testing. They already kind of did the work for you. So that you can buy that thing, plug it in, and get it going. So I think if I'm interpreting your question right, when you say more of an app store approach, I think that's maybe what you're describing. Feel free to leave a follow-up. But I think both approaches are useful. So it's going to depend on the company you work at and what resources they have, and and what the end product is. So, and what I mean by that is you might be a small company and you're trying to build something revolutionary from the ground up. And so you might just say, hey, it's okay if I have to build all these blocks from the ground up because this is going to be the bedrock of my company and I want to know it in and out. It needs to be bespoke and perfect. You might work for a big company that has lots of capital behind it and they're like, we need a solution tomorrow. And you go on, you go, oh, hey, Xilinx offers this board and it offers this right connectivity and it comes with this software package and it's a one-click buy and it's here and we have functionality tomorrow. The smaller company may not have the capital to just throw for that kind of turnkey solution to just go. So it's just going to depend. I think both approaches are useful. It's just going to depend. What do you need as an engineer? Do you need it now? Or as a company, you may not have the engineering resources to build something from the ground up. You might be able to afford an FPGA, but if you don't have engineers that have substantial FPGA experience, then it's useful for a company to offer these kind of turnkey solutions of here's the FPGA, but here's some building blocks that go with it so that you can get started right away.
You know, it's interesting. I've talked about AMD's acquisition of Xilinx from the perspective of their hard design team that's apparently world-class at working with TSMC. That's something AMD wasn't as good at, I've heard, before they acquired them. And then I've also, of course, it's like, well, they also offer all these other products that can be bundled with AMD stuff. It appears to be, talking to you now, that also a major benefit of having Xilinx become a part of AMD is their expertise building these FPGAs that are used to do R&D, right?
Yeah, potentially. I don't know what AMD's current prototyping workflows look like.
Yeah.
But it definitely helps, I think, with so much of it being on FPGA and digital design, having that expertise in-house.
Yeah, I just think that's definitely potentially a part of it. And a lot of people ask me, is there any other reason AMD's buying Xilinx? And I think you're kind of touching on a lot of that there. So okay, moving on to the kind of the final IP block of discussion points, if you will, that we are going to go through. Let me see. I just kind of want to ask an open question here. It's something that I try to, I try to only talk about geopolitical things when they're on subject, but I think I have an on subject question to ask you. Is there going to be a worse time to release a 500-watt graphics card than when gas prices are soaring because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
I think for big companies, it probably doesn't matter, right? I think what we saw with at least coronavirus and the lockdowns, there was a lot of companies buckled for less business, especially in the tech sector, and ended up getting more. Zoom, Microsoft, everybody was scrambling to just add more cloud infrastructure, just buying up tons and tons and tons of chips. So I think for big tech companies, whatever the price comes out to be, I think they're going to eat that cost no matter what, because if they don't buy it, their competitor will.
Exactly, yeah. But for gamers, though, I guess.
For gamers, yeah, it's kind of this perfect storm. We're already trying to get out of this hump of shortages and logistics problems that have been associated with the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Now, on top of it, we have a war going on that's going to upset, it's going to displace people, it's going to upset the economy. That's the thing about the world we live in today. It's so connected that we're not going to even know what trickles out of this conflict in terms of upsetting the economy, because we always find out we're connected in ways we never really thought of before. So energy, I think, is kind of the obvious one in terms of there's a real opportunity cost now of now it costs more to heat my home and buy electricity and do all that stuff. Do I really want to spend an arm and a leg on what's already an expensive GPU just for it to suck up a bunch of power? And that's that utility argument of, one, can you afford it, right? Opportunity cost is different for everybody. If you're really well off, you may not care. But for some people, that's the difference between them being able to, afford gas to get to work or heat their home and do that kind of thing. So,
yeah, I think in general, people are just underestimating the realignment of how much is going to change when it comes to supply chains and alliances between, or just the geopolitics between different countries, that we're looking at a complete realigning of the relations between dozens of countries right now. And that if we assume it's just, oh, well, Ukraine makes a bunch of grain, so food prices are going to go up, gas prices are going to go up. I think there's a lot of hard to predict things. And I think I would remind everyone that, and I talked about this with the OEM in PC OEM engineer that I had on last year, or was it over a year ago? I don't know. It was a while ago. And we talked about how when the pandemic started, everyone was like, well, people are going to buy less, so we better make less computers. And then just immediately it's yeah, except now we're all using the cloud, so what are you doing? And I worry that there's a lot of things going on now with predictions in the markets where I'm like, this is way bigger repercussions than just higher oil prices with Russia. This is definitely going to affect how we work with China too and everyone else.
Yeah, I totally agree. This is going to have ramifications on all parts of our daily lives. Yeah, not just the fuel prices. I think that'll probably be the one people are paying attention to, but yeah, we're going to have supply shortages and all kinds of different shortages that cascade out from this in ways that we can't predict. So yeah, I don't know what else to say. I think we're all kind of just watching this with at least every day I'm kind of glued to the headlines to see what's happening and how this is going to shake out, not just from an economic perspective, but just this is a very major event in I think all of our lives in terms of political alignment and conflict and even just the thought of nuclear weapons and stuff think about the nuclear arsenal, really.
Yeah.
And now everyone's kind of thinking like, oh yeah.
Which, I don't know what you think. I think it's incredibly unlikely, even if there was a conventional war between, I don't know, let's say NATO and Russia, that there would be any nukes launched. But on the podcast Angry Planet, which I've had Jason Fields on from that podcast before, and we talked about what would happen if something happened with TSMC, how that would affect supply chains. On a recent episode, they brought up on their podcast, or their guest did, an expert on Russian politics, it's not that we need to worry about like some Armageddon nuclear thing right away, but is it that inconceivable that if Russia felt threatened, they would launch a very, very, very tiny nuke at a remote power station, and it really wouldn't kill a lot of people, but they would do it to prove they're willing to use them? That's the type of thing I worry about.
Yeah, so there's been discussion about, where do so-called, in quotes, tactical nukes fit into all of this? These kind of low-yield, meant to supplement conventional warfare type weapons. I think something like that would be pretty effective at sending a message.
The message, are you so sure I won't ever use these?
Right. And I think it does totally change the calculus of warfare, because something like a tactical nuke's never been used, right? So not only are you, probably destroying some target of interest with it, but also saying, yep, these are the rules now. Like, and what does that say for Russia's potential adversaries? Does that give them the okay that, now tactical nukes in conventional warfare are okay? Like, it's a weird precedent.
Because it's an escalation if that happens.
Yeah, it's an escalation, and that's really what we all want to avoid, is escalation, and lean towards diplomacy, of course. So.
Yeah, and that was, hearing that on the podcast Angry Planet, I keep plugging it, is that kind of like mental wall that I got through where I was like, yeah, but I don't think we're ever launching a bunch of nukes at each other. And it's like, no, but not right away. Kind of like if the evolution of it, the missing link in the evolution, if you will, is, oh, but that could be the first step. I can never think of what a first step would be. And it's like, oh, we blew up this remote hydroelectric plant in the middle of nowhere. Only killed 10 people with this nuke, but guess what? We actually used a nuke now.
Yeah, and even with like World War II, the use of nuclear weapons was primarily to send a message. There's a lot of loss of innocent life in the meantime and things like that, and that was because we wanted that message to be heard loud and clear. So I think two things happen. Is like launching a nuke to send a message is one thing. Starting to use them tactically in a conventional warfare is another. I would hope if they were to use one, it would be solely to send a message. Because I can't imagine really a world where we're lobbing tactical nukes at each other all day in conventional warfare. It just sounds awful.
Well, I think I'm guessing you'll agree with me. I don't think me and you could have imagined that a couple months ago, but it seems clear to me, I'll just say, we're not dealing with the type of rationality we thought we were with the severity of this invasion. This isn't, we thought there was this 4D chess thing going on. I don't know, actually, anymore. I think we might have to maybe stop assuming everyone is as rational as we think they are.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate that the nuclear option is such a big bargaining chip. Because, you could imagine a situation where Russia didn't inherit this huge Cold War arsenal of nukes. Maybe denuclearization took a different path, and the number of warheads out there was far reduced, and, mutually assured destruction wasn't a thing. How much of a bargaining chip would they have in conventional warfare? Almost none. If it's just a numbers game of NATO versus Russia, I think the West would have acted a lot sooner if it wasn't just for this one big bargaining chip.
But there's a reason the West is being more cautious with any further support, right, of Ukraine.
Right.
This seems to maybe be a much more real bargaining chip than we thought, because we thought the conflict wouldn't escalate this much, but clearly whether it's a lack of rationality or the variables they're considering are not what we are,
Right.
we misjudged the situation and how bad it would probably get. I think we all knew it could be an option what's happened now, but I don't think we thought it was a plurality of the chance of what was going to happen.
Right. So, had this been limited to a conventional conflict, I think the West would have been a lot more eager to.
I mean,
move
between
in.
solely conventional powers.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think it probably would have escalated to more direct confrontation by now. But yeah, just that nuclear option makes everybody hesitant. So I kind of understand why both sides are. Putin's kind of playing it to his advantage, right? He knows that his army probably isn't. Well, it's no match for NATO.
There's a lot of people who get mad at you listening to that, but I'm sorry. Like from what we're seeing in the results so far, it's not.
I'm not saying it'd be an easy fight.
No.
Or one that anyone would want to fight.
No.
But I mean, if you look at just the United States military spending and development since the end of World War II, I mean, it's pretty much solely was focused on combating the Soviet Union and Russia technologically.
And the spending didn't go down after the Cold
Yeah,
War.
so you're talking about, these forces were, and NATO in its existence, its sole primary focus is to confront Russia in a situation like this. And now we're stuck kind of at the mercy of, well, we can't use any of those tools and all this spending because of the nuclear option. And so Putin's kind of having the in my opinion, he can abuse the effectiveness of the effectiveness of his conventional warfare is a little bit he's kind of getting away easy, that no one's confronting him because he's got the nuclear option in his back pocket.
Right, and because of that nuclear option's in the back pocket, it's clear the West's plan is, well, if we just do overwhelming, like we've never seen, sanctions, constricting, you can't even play as the Russian team in FIFA, like that type of stuff, like that, at least it feels like we're in the conflict, even if we're not directly, and it makes the toll of this conflict, if it goes on for a while, feel like if Russia was fighting the West directly. Because frankly, it's almost like they are at this point. But I would say, though, on that note, then something I wanted to touch on too is I don't think it's going to be over in a month. I keep seeing these reporters like, hopefully this will be over in a month, and I'm like, guys, what? How many times do we need to see a conflict and go, we'll be back by Christmas? Like, we're not going to be back by Christmas once you start something. And even if something ended, like, I'll just say it, like the harshness of this invasion, Ukraine's not going to go, oh, we lost, well, we're friends again. No, this is going to be decades of resentment because of the harshness of this campaign on them. So this is something I think the entire world's going to be dealing with for a long time. And not to sound detached emotionally, but to try to bring it on subject to this, like how I see this going on for at least a year, massive disruptions to various, like, I mean, at the very least, the food production out of Ukraine is going to affect everything with that going down. How do you think this is going to sound real bad. How do you think this will affect prices, though, moving forward? Like, do you think we're seeing shortages improve? We're seeing prices falling down pretty consistently here every week. Do you think this is going to be bad enough to make them kind of stall where they're at soon? Or do you think it's because of how bad the shortages were before, just literally not enough stuff, that it's still going to get better in that aspect, even if, like, gas prices rise?
Yeah, that's a good one.
I know.
It's hard to imagine things getting a lot worse than where they were in terms of supply shortage. Because then, I mean, the whole world was kind of halted through COVID. I mean, you had literal production stops on not just, not just with chips and that whole supply chain, but everything. everything got affected: cars, transportation, like just every aspect of human life. There was some kind of delay or shortage associated with it that we're still trying to recover from. So in that aspect, I don't think this conflict, unless, you know, forbid it gets way out of hand, is just going to stop the world from continuing to produce as best as can, find alternate suppliers, things like that. So this may be just kind of my own naive point of view. So maybe I don't understand the economics as well.
Well, I'm talking to you, so I'd love to hear what yours is.
Yeah, so unless this has the potential to make everything stop the way COVID did, I don't see it being worse.
Yeah.
So
from that perspective.
I'm at least hopeful that, you know, prices are going to recover in some capacity. I think we're still going to have some shortages. We're still going to have some trickle down of the logistics of moving things around, especially with fuel prices affected. But it's not a whole hard stop the way COVID was.
Yeah, it's funny. It's like, I guess, now that you put it that way, like if it's mostly about the gas prices, what's the graphics card that was priced ludicrously high for what people wanted it to cost? Mostly because of the shipping, 6500 XT. Like, you know,
Yeah.
if you take what used to be $5 ship and make it $30, that makes a, you know, $170 card 200.
Yeah.
So I think it's funny. I think next gen we're more of this truncation of the high end will be as profitable to make again at like $1,000 as it was last gen. But again, $200 is just kicked. It's, you know, it's going to continue to be pretty bad, I think, in that realm.
Yeah, I guess I would say this. I'm hopeful that supply will get better. I don't know that pricing will be any different, right?
Well, that's a good point too. Those are two different things. We're seeing supply. Like, what do you want? We can go buy it on Newegg right now. It's just the pricing's not what we want it to be at.
Yeah. So that's kind of the vision, the future I'm seeing in my head at least, is just like, yeah, you probably be able to go buy a card, but it's probably not going to be the price that
we were hoping
you would want or hope for.
QH Freddy writes in, he says there's been a lot of noise lately regarding bringing manufacturing back to Western soil, but most of that is focused only on high-end semiconductor fabbing. What about less exciting stuff? Passive components, PCBs, assembly, or even more basic things like raw and processed materials needed for the manufacturing? How much can we really reduce our reliance on foreign economies? And I think this is a very good question and point he's touching on, because in talking to some of my contacts, putting together like the BOM cost per ampere, and then especially recently the RTX 3050 and 6500 XT, it's not the silicon guys, it's all of the heatsink manufacturers in China that just aren't in the US.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think it really highlights how globalization is. You know, every decade it gets even more interconnected in ways that we never think about. COVID was kind of the big stress test on that, and we saw tons of industries kind of fall to their knees in terms of production, because we rely on so much from foreign produced materials and foreign assembly and yeah, it's hard to say anything's made any one place anymore. And, you know, the United States, you know, we still have good amount of chip fabs here, stuff like that. Intel still does a lot of fabbing here, Samsung, you know, Texas Instruments, plus there's a lot of boutique fabs that do things that aren't high density logic. You know, there's other fabs for like optical sensors and power transistors, FETs, things like that go into your power supplies, and so not all of it, not all the fabbing capacity has to be, you know, cutting edge, smallest transistors you can get away with. In fact, in some designs, that's not even desirable. You want bigger transistors for their properties. So I think the United States is in a good spot to something happens that, all of our shipments from Southeast Asia just cease.
If it was just an abrupt thing.
Mm-hmm. Then how good is the United States? What kind of position are they in
I'd say
terms
not good for at least a year.
Yeah, and a lot of that has to do with some of the more non-specialized goods. I would say like just building like heat sinks and machined parts and stuff like that. We don't do it in the volume, say that China does for kind of these commodity things that we need to put electronics together. Resistors, capacitors, just all that stuff. We don't push that out in volume. One big part of that is just the nature of capitalism. The work tends to go where the labor is cheap.
Mm-hmm.
Electronics manufacturing was really big, heavy in Japan, and then it moved to China. And I think even at some point, its days in China are numbered, and it's going to move to. I think it's even being explored.
Well, it's so automated now, right? That you almost wonder.
Where's it's going to go? India, Vietnam, Indonesia. There's already movements of certain manufacturing stuff even moving out of China to find ever cheaper labor and things like that. So part of it is labor, and part of it is also just what materials do you need. Asia is a huge continent. China is a huge supplier of rare earth metals and things like that. So as far as having all the stuff they need to support a manufacturing industry, that's very much to their advantage. So moving stuff back to the United States, I think in a way that is usable volume is going to be hard.
Right. It sounds like it's kind of inevitable that a lot of it starts moving to the West now, and out in South America, all over. Besides just Asia, Southeast Asia, but that if there was an abrupt cutoff to it, anytime in the next 5 years, we won't be done transitioning a lot of it.
And part of that is just going to be, should that kind of worst scenario happen where we're in some kind of conflict or otherwise we're cut off from those supply chains, the way we live our lives is going to have to be different anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Because all of that manufacturing capacity that we do have in the United States will probably get focused on military or other, essential needs before it ever goes back to consumer devices, if ever.
I think for a few years during World War II, in the U.S., you literally couldn't buy a new car. Like, they just didn't make them. It's like we're too busy making tanks and airplanes.
Yeah. So I would imagine something similar would happen where the manufacturing capacity that does exist, it's going to be busy not making consumer goods anyway.
Mm-hmm. Well, Timo H. writes in, he says, regarding age-old things in geopolitics and manufacturing, is there any danger energy, material-heavy, and critical industries like silicon are in danger of running out of fuel, water, the raw material itself, cooling or other parts, either by prices being too volatile or some locations cutting off supply to other places due to political problems and changed priorities? I don't believe the U.S., for example, is in much danger right now, but the silicon industry itself seems very vulnerable, both from a supply chain complexity viewpoint and needing those raw materials or products supplied from only a very few places in the world. From watching American news, it seems like there's a lot of America First talk going on right now, but what does that mean to gamers, scientists, and others in Europe or Southeast Asia? Do these areas have enough political capital to ensure availability of those products for themselves? Which is something I think not enough people bring up, is like anytime America complains, Europe's like, double complaining about these issues.
So, I guess...
You already touched on a lot of that, I think.
Yeah, I think we already touched on a lot of that.
Silicon itself, and I don't know if you have any idea of the materials needed.
No. I'm not aware. At least I don't track who the suppliers are out there for wafers and stuff. The lithography process itself can be pretty complex in terms of the chemistry involved and what types of different chemicals and elements you need to source for it.
I'm looking it up. The biggest exporters of silicon for manufacturing chips is Russia and Brazil.
Okay.
So,
I mean, I would imagine we could spin those industries up if need be. But one thing to think about is I don't know how much of like rare earth metals is kind of one of the big ones.
And there's so many of them.
And what kind of exotic things do you need to build chips? So you'd have to get into the specifics of any process to really understand, what the high dollar limited items are. But especially with like RF engineering and communications stuff, rare earth metals, especially in like modems in your cell phone and stuff like that.
Yeah, when you say RF, you mean radio frequency for those listening.
Yeah, so RF or high frequency type stuff. Yeah, you need rare earth metals to make them as compact and as performant as the consumer expects them to be. So if you suddenly don't have access to those, it's like, well, can you even build, an iPhone anymore? You might have to actually just make some compromises on what products can even do. And so there's this thing that happens in technology, and I think it's that 80-20 rule again that I mentioned earlier. A good analogy is the energy sector and electric cars and even things like solar panels. It's like, yeah, this energy is free and it's cheap, and then it's like, yeah, we'll just push the efficiency a lot higher and higher, and then we'll totally rid our dependence on oil. But it's like, to push the efficiency of battery tech and to push the efficiency of solar cells to an extreme level usually requires exotic materials and exotic manufacturing, to the point where the benefits of it being cheap and plentiful and easy get eroded. Those then become very fragile things to produce. And we've kind of already done that to our society, where a lot of our consumer products are already fragile in terms of supply chain, and our expectations for them as products are already reliant on things that are short in supply and not easy to get. So if you were to re-stand up manufacturing, I think it would be a step back technologically in a lot of ways, because it's just, hey, we don't have this rare.
We literally don't have it, so we need to find a new way to make screens.
Either we find a new material that can do it, or or your product is 50% bigger because I have to put 2 radios in it now because the one radio can't do both functions now.
All right, so I want to start winding down with some final reader mails here. This one's a little related to what we were just talking about. Clean Sweep writes in, and he says, "Hey, Tom and Matt, I'm interested in hearing more about the challenges of putting computer hardware in aerospace stuff, like planes and satellites. I remember hearing somewhere, maybe even here on Broken Silicon actually, that a lot of the newer, smaller foundry nodes are vulnerable to the kinds of radiation that you find in outer space. Besides that, in the G-forces involved in going beyond supersonic speeds. What other things do aerospace engineers have to think about when incorporating computer hardware to be put in space?"
Okay, yeah, so that's a good question. Space is a fun place to work engineering projects, because it makes you think about a bunch of different stuff that you wouldn't on the ground. So specifically with computing power, one thing you really have to consider, especially in building satellite payloads or I'm sure even aircraft, is choose the computer that's right for the job. What I mean by that is you're not going to slap an i7 or Horizon into a satellite unless you need that throughput. So almost all the computers that are going in satellites and aircraft, they're very specifically chosen for how they perform, and it's kind of it's a less is more type thing is kind of the better way to go about it. You only want to put as much computing power in there as you need. And you only want it to consume as much power as you've budgeted for. And so a lot of the ways we think about computing of just like, oh, let's get the next best thing every time something new comes out, it's really not that way for space and aero. It's really about, does this thing fit a need? The utility argument is at the forefront. Literally, if it doesn't add enough utility, then we don't want it. So there really is no rush to put the next greatest, best CPU in a spacecraft, unless the mission dictates that you need it or the mission fails, type thing.
You know, one thing I've read recently in a couple articles is that typically a lot of the computers put in spaceships, satellites, are based on lithography from several generations ago. Some of that's about the stability, the ease of use. Also, these projects take many years to be done, so it's like, whatever, that's what we designed 5 years ago, that's what they had. But I've also heard that there's something with just the reliability of the newer nodes long term isn't there, that silicon at 5 nanometer, it's never really been an issue before when I troubleshoot PCs. It's like, I just assume the Intel or AMD processor hasn't broken. It's the motherboard or RAM or something, you know? But I've heard that once we get to 5 nanometer, it's like, no, your phone's going to break in 3 years because the silicon is going to just wear out from the voltage usage.
Yeah, I think as just PC consumers and general electronics consumers, we've always kind of had it in our mind that we're going to reach obsolescence before we reach failure in terms of the silicon. I would be interested to see how that changes as we get to these smaller nodes. If it's something you have to think about, man, we're sure throwing in a lot of things to think about when buying a computer.
Yeah, like you buy an RDNA 3 or maybe 4 nanometer, 3 nanometer RDNA 4 chip, and you're like, hey, I know this is $2,000, and it's like you see these people, oh, I'm going to keep it for 5 years. No, you're not. Not if you mine with it, because it's going to wear out in 1 year now. Unlike other, I mean, I've had 28 nanometer chips that just they could mine for another 10 years probably.
Right. But going back to the space thing, yeah, a lot of times lower or bigger featured transistors are desirable because they require more energy to switch states. And that's actually beneficial in space. Like when you're building a computer and you just want to do things as efficiently as possible, you don't want to spend a lot of energy getting a transistor to switch its state. But in space, where you're getting bombarded by radiation, you don't want stray radiation getting a transistor to switch its state. And one way to do that is if the transistor is bigger, it requires more energy. So you get more radiation resiliency that way. They also go to great lengths to do radiation shielding on the packaging to make sure that it can survive a certain level of energetic particle bombardment. And they're probably also more vigorously tested in terms of like vibration and temperature stability and things like that. So it's going to depend on the mission, what chip you choose. A big word for a lot of the spacecraft and aerospace industry is legacy. Choosing parts that have flown in past missions and are proven, as opposed to new things that could go wrong. And it takes a long time to build a reliable, proven platform for the air or space.
Which again, let's be clear about what reliable means here. We're not saying it lasts 5 years. We're saying this satellite that we're sending to Pluto lasts 50.
Yeah, I mean, look at how long Voyager's lasted. Some of these Mars rovers have far outlasted their useful mission time. Everyone's hoping that the James Webb Telescope is going to be able to have enough fuel to do its mission. But yeah, so longevity in space, it's like when you're spending so much money on a project, it has to work. You're not going to take a lot of risk on new technologies, and you're gonna put something new unless it really enables you to do something cool. And needed. I think that's what a lot of people miss about, like, oh, why doesn't the new Mars rover have a 4K camera on it and stuff like that? It's like, well, unless it's enabling something for science that's really important, it's literally just adding risk to the rest of the mission.
Well, and you can see this in military vehicles as well. You look at like the footage out of a attack helicopter and it looks horrible clarity, but it has thermal sights and it can see a dot. And that's actually all it needs to see to identify a target.
Yeah, and exactly. And, if the computer, as long as the computer has what it needs to track its target in terms of a targeting system, how well you can see it is not how well it's tracking. So yeah, there's a disconnect. It's that whole utility thing of we're used to as consumers things looking prettier and shinier and high resolution. I mean, we waste so much computing power just so that your phone is showing you pretty notifications, and we spend so much computation power on just it looking pretty when the fundamentals of the computing that's going on underneath are actually pretty light in comparison to just hey, it looks nice.
I mean, yeah, how many of the computational power is just pulling out a higher res image for an icon on a website when,
Yeah, and the text is like nothing. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to have one more reader mail here to wrap this up. Luke Mines writes in, he says, hello, Matt and Tom. What sort of career tracks are possible in the fields of working with FPGAs and PCB design? I'm sure a lot. Because I have an interest here, and aside from requiring an electrical engineering degree, I'm not too sure what the career opportunities and working conditions would look like. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that at all.
Sure. So, yeah, electrical engineering degree definitely helps. As far as PCB design, you could get started today. You can go online. There are free CAD tools for doing PCB design. I know EagleCAD is one of them. There's another software called Circuit Studio, if you could look at, that has a free version. But you could get started today. What's been kind of nice is with kind of the boom of the makerspace and things like that, is the amount of open source designs you can go look at and download has really, and the tools that are available for just hobbyists at home to do circuit design and build has really exploded. So there's no shortage of stuff that you can go access on the web, get a design for, and start practicing building PCBs today. So
I mean, I did some PCB design even as a mechanical engineer,
Yeah, I think it's probably something a good amount of engineers bump up into at some point, especially in electrical and mechanical engineering. There's not really, at least my experience going through school, it was never like, hey, take this track and you'll get really good at PCB design. There's definitely like a course here and there, but a lot of it's like any tool. Even getting good at something like Photoshop or whatever, you need to spend time with the tool. And employers are really gonna care that you've spent time with the tool and you can do the certain things with the tool. So start getting experience with those tools. That's gonna be a lot more valuable than just saying, hey, I took a course. It's like, no, look at these things I built. So that's very valuable. As far as FPGA stuff, there are probably some FPGA boards that are within the price point for hobbyists to start playing with. There are definitely some other devices. There's another class of devices called a CPLD, CMOS programmable logic device. It's kind of in a similar vein of an FPGA, but they're cheap enough that you could buy them and get started with like hardware descriptor languages and building little digital circuits on your own at home. You'd probably encounter one if you took a digital design class in an electrical engineering course. But as far as applying FPGAs, if you want to get into a field where they're used often, communications is a good thing to go into. So
What type of
communications?
It's not like literally I got a degree in communications. That's a very typical.
So I mean more like radios.
Yeah.
Building 5G or SATCOM or those kinds of things. Get into digital design and chip verification, like design verification, digital design. You're almost always going to run into FPGAs. Yeah, I'd say those would be if you do get into electrical engineering, that's where you want to probably focus.
Yeah, I mean, I can't I can't give any advice on that there, but I knew you said you wanted to answer any questions that touch on that type of stuff if they came up.
And if you're a real masochist, you can go into RF design, and that's a whole other layer of PCB design that is really
on Patreon if you can to ask us questions, get ad-free versions of the shows, get exclusive podcasts like Die Shrink, talk with us, both the community and me after content comes out on the Discord, and so much more. Can't do this without our patrons. And otherwise, stay safe out there, everybody, and thanks for listening.
This podcast was brought to you by the YouTube channel and website Moore's Law is Dead. Moore's Law is Dead and Broken Silicon are trademarks of their creator, Tom. That guy is me, and I am indeed the creator, editor, writer, and showrunner of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, videos, articles, and other media. However, I don't do this alone. Moore's Law is Dead is a team with Broken Silicon co-hosted by my brother, Dan. Audio editing by Gerard Cortez and special assistance by Carbon Cry. Find all of our information, including the information of sponsors you can support, at www.mooreslawsdead.com. If you would like to send fan mail or hardware to us, please mail parcels to Moore's Law is Dead at P.O. Box 60632 in Nashville, Tennessee, zip code 37206. And speaking of fans, patrons are what makes Moore's Law is Dead content possible. The aging business model of spamming ads all over the content is dying. The future of media will be built on fans paying for the content they actually want to exist. And so if you have the extra money, but only if you do, please consider supporting us. For just $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive podcast Die Shrink, voting on subjects of future podcast episodes, the ability to have your questions read aloud on Broken Silicon, Die Shrink, and Loose Ends, and of course, access to the Moore's Law is Dead Discord full of like-minded people who would love to meet you and talk to you about computer hardware. I am one of them. Additionally, higher tiers get access to ad-free episodes of Broken Silicon, the entire back catalog of Flyover States podcasts and other projects Moore's Law is Dead has done, and thanks in the credits of videos and other perks as well. And hey, if you can't afford to support us, please do share Moore's Law is Dead videos and podcasts with friends and family on social media, Reddit, and forums, and give Broken Silicon a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or your preferred podcast app. All of this really does help so much. And if you'd like to advertise on the podcast, hire Tom for consulting, or are a person of interest who would like to be a guest, please reach out to the email address mlhbdead@gmail.com. But as I said, this podcast would not be possible without its patrons supporting it, and so now it is time to give a personal thanks to the greatest of the fans. The following supporters are at the 10 gigahertz or higher producer levels:
Brad Mellon, Anthony Greffa, Dale Russell, Jeremy Scalen, Loophole 35, Thomas Rupp, I Love You, Linda Jim, Ivan K, Tom Bailey, Muhammad Al-Kawari, Eric Osmore, Jeff Sedler, Andre Jacques, Sarcastro, Terrence Herod, Drita Full, Phil S, D31337 Antics, Jackson A. Miller, Jesse Jaskowiak, Josh Law, Brandon, Travis Gooding, The Mechanical Philosopher, Gaiman Since Reagan, Fatboy D. Saru, Daniel Hyde, A Guy in PA, Nathan Mose, Coal Addict, Matt Salem, Aaron Close, F7G.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Star Citizen Live, the Narrative Team Q&A. I'm your host, Jared Huckabee. And if for some reason you've never seen Star Citizen Live before, maybe you've just joined the project through our recent free fly, for instance. I was about to say free fly. It was like in that meeting yesterday when we kept saying hot box instead of contest. If you've never, welcome to the show. This is a good start. None of you are going to say anything. You're just going to let me just flail.
I'm just enjoying it. No,
Just going to let me flail here.
It's great.
Yeah, it's pretty nice. Pretty good.
If you've never seen Star Citizen Live before, it's where we take about an hour out of the end of our week and we hang out with members of our staff and we We talk a little bit about who they are, what they do, and answer questions from you, the Star Citizen community. Joining us on the show this week are several members of our esteemed narrative team. Starting with, we'll do introductions this way. A man who probably needs no introduction, but we're going to make him do it anyway. Mr. Dave Haddock. Dave, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Tell people who you are. What do you do?
I am the narrative director over here at CIG, and basically we kind of work on both a lot of the fiction stuff for the Star Citizen as well as Squadron 42, work scripts, characters, props, name descriptions, languages. We do weekly lore posts. We do all sorts of stuff. So yeah, we kind of have our hands many pies throughout the company. So
Many pies. Adam, who are you? What do you do for Star Citizen?
I am Adam, and I work for Dave, and I work as a writer here, and do all those things that Dave needs support on, whether it's lore post, item descriptions, jump point, on and on and on and on. So
I thought you were going to say all those things Dave doesn't want to do. I really thought that's where you were going with that.
Potentially, yeah. I don't know. It depends on how it all falls. So, but yeah.
And of course, longtime viewers may remember Dave and Adam from our recurring Lore Maker's Guide to the Galaxy series that used to air on YouTube in yay old days. We have two new faces, not new to the company or the project, but maybe new to you. So we're going to start with this direction. It's mirrored here. Blythe, who are you, and what do you do for Star Citizen?
Hi, I'm Blythe. I am the associate producer for the narrative team. I've actually only been here for a few months, so I am relatively new to the company. So I'm very excited to be here. Excited to wrangle these weirdos.
I was going to say, what is a producer for the narrative team?
It's like herding cats mostly. But yeah, you take all of the requests that come in for your team, and then you figure out who's going to do this and when are they going to do it, and then you tell them, if they're going to do it, and you get to say no sometimes. That's fun. So, sometimes, not often.
Wait, saying no is an option?
Wow. We need to talk to your producer, I guess.
Nobody told Jared that. That's why he's doing the show.
And last and least, Mike Kinchella. Who are you and what do you do?
Hi, Jared. First time, long time. And I'm happy to be here. I'm the resident copywriter, member of the narrative team. I work on a lot of the copy you see on the website for, when we come out with new spaceships or release old spaceships into the wild, or when we do any sort of marketing stuff. You see the IAE and Invictus and all the big fun marketing events that cross over into the game. I'm working on those things. Ship commercials, any video content you see that's lore related, a lot of that is coming through me. And yeah, a lot of the strawberry rhubarb pie is most of the pie that I have my fingers in. And I was gonna say that when you ask Blythe what she does, I'm like, Blythe is the one that sorts the pies for us to put our hands into. She makes sure that today is the lemon meringue instead of the coconut cream or whatever. So that's it. That's what she does.
I guess
She does a
it's
good
gonna
job.
be our theme for the day is pies.
Pies?
It's going to devolve into meat pies soon. And
Meat pies
Meat
are
pies are
delicious.
disgusting.
Oh,
No.
see what I told you?
Ooh, uh-oh.
It's going to turn into a debate.
Now we got our first question.
And then super observant folks who have been around for a while might recognize Mike as the disgusting homunculus from our
That's
first
true.
Easy Have of Horror video. And
I've been lurking around for a few years now. You may have, close observers may have seen me in old episodes of This Is Star Citizen and various other weird places in the Star Citizen universe.
All right, so with introductions out of the way, we'll get into the questions from the community. As usual, you can, if you're watching live on Twitch, you can submit your question with the word "question" in capital letters surrounded by brackets. It's going to help me pull it out from the rest of the chat that's going on. Just as a reminder, this is the narrative team. So if your question is when Banu Merchantman, or how will salvaging work, or anything like that. This is not the team for that. This is the team for the story and the history and the context behind the universe that you're playing today. So right off the bat, we'll go to the thread that we put up earlier this week. You knew the top voted question was going to be Tessa related. Like every single time we do this, we know this is the case, and this is no different. Will we see the return of missions with lore/story behind them, like the old Tessa missions, following a quest line and finding a bigger story unfolding if we spend the time to explore more?
Yes, I mean that's the goal, is that we're trying to build towards. I mean, obviously right now a lot of it is sort of building the mechanics of the various mission types that we'll be able to do. But the idea ultimately has always been like, we want to take those missions and then start to apply much more story, much more character, and to get people more involved and stuff like that. But it's right now it's about getting those initial framework blueprints out functioning and kind of refined, and then we can kind of play around and have fun.
Yeah, if you watched yesterday's Inside Star Citizen, we had a feature with Ben Dorsey on the changes to the reputation system, and a lot of the tweaks that are happening to the reputation system will unlock a variety of storytelling options for our mission designers and stuff, which is one of the really exciting aspects of that. It's a change happening internally that will then hopefully yield to much more interesting and engaging quest and mission opportunities for the players, and those will all obviously involve the narrative team. Let's see. Next question: how does Squadron 42 end? Let's see.
Spectacularly.
Everybody dies.
You know that one was going to come up too. It's legitimately in the chat. People can watch. People can watch the replay.
Spectacularly, I like that. Yes.
Spectacularly. The Klaus and Werner laser repeaters are all named after Earth animals, with one notable exception: the CF-557 Galderine. What is a Galderine?
Is it notable though?
It was notable to this person.
Galderine is a fictional animal, I believe. That, but I don't think it's been established quite yet what it is, but it is a fictional animal.
Yeah, I think sort of the idea of it was just that, again, like we had a handful of known animals, but in the era of this time, they would have planets that were not terraformed, so they would have their own wildlife, basically, that some animal would basically be of note that would be a good inspiration for this weapon. That's the idea. But what it is, we don't know yet.
Yeah, it gives us a little room whenever the character team designs some cool animals in the future. That gives us one out there to be able to name it. And when we do name a bunch of things like that, we always, sometimes there's a philosophy like two real, one fake. Just kind of like make up something that would be a word or a thing that could be in this world that kind of helps build a little mystery into it, or give it a little history outside of what we know, just so it's a nice reminder to the player and everyone that we're in a different time. So it is something we build in, and like I said, we need so many names for so many different things, and the world keeps expanding, so it's nice to have a few of those there to be able to rely on whenever we might need a name like that. So we shall see.
Let's see, what else we got? Let's see. Have Tavaran citizen numbers increased since the Better Together initiative that promotes Tavarans becoming citizens and voting?
We haven't explored the exact details of that yet, about whether the numbers have gone up. I think it would be a good place to go on to do another dispatch in the future that explores that. I do think that that's the direction that things are going for the Tavaran in relation to the UEE. I think with Suj Kozi being elected a senator, and with kind of the resurgence of the Tavaran like within the wider UEE culture, that's definitely how it's going. And I also wouldn't be surprised with the war with the Vanduul occurring, a lot of that happening in or near systems that, where Elysium, where the Tavaran are originally from, that they have now been part of the UE long enough that they would be motivated to come to the defense, sign up, go into the Army and the Navy, and that is one of the ways you become a citizen. So, yeah, I think seeing an increase of Ta'Varen presence and engagement in the Empire is definitely happening out there, and is honestly something really cool. I'm looking forward to exploring, as we expand out the game. Because there's also another system which isn't technically in UE space, called Branagh, and that's where the largest population of Ta'Varen are. So there's even outside of the population in the UE, there are some Ta'Varen who have gone to this other system and are starting their own culture there too. So they might not be citizens, but the cultural influence of what they're doing there, you might see start seeping into the UE in other ways too. So yeah, there's a lot of fun to be had there, and we're kind of laying these strings, and we can't wait to kind of start tying something together and for the world.
Yeah, let's follow up on that answer and the one before. It might come as a surprise to some folks that when you name something Galderine, or when you set something up like the Better Together initiative, that you don't just immediately carry that thread all the way to the end. The minute you come up with it. Why is that? I mean, I know why it is, but let's talk about it for the viewers. Why don't you just, every time you come up with an idea, why don't you just drill that idea into the ground and come up with every single facet right away?
Well, I think part of it is the hope that we want players to be able to experience it firsthand, that storylines will be kind of developing while they're in the universe. Down the road, we want to be able to start making these kind of have more direct influence on the actual players and what they're doing and stuff like that. And it's basically, if we were to introduce something and then resolve it purely in the fiction, then it's not something that the players get to ever experience. We want to, again, the idea has always been to make this a living, breathing, growing universe. So we want to allow for that growth, with the players. So it's not just something that we're doing arbitrarily on our own, and we're creating all the stuff that players are getting to experience it kind of in real time as well, which is kind of fun.
I imagine there's got to be some aspect of time management too. You create a bunch of hooks, and then see which ones resonate with the players, which ones don't, and stuff like this. And then you take the ones that resonate, you take those ones further. You don't just spend time, spend hours, days, weeks developing a thing and then watching it fall flat. Because not everything works.
Yeah, and I mean, in general, it's also an extremely collaborative process here between, the character team design, and so we're also a part of a much bigger picture. And I know this is a metaphor that Dave used a lot, and I love to use, is that we're sculpting, and when you're sculpting, you're basically putting in the very rough base form first, the big general idea, and then you start to dig into the details. And not all those details are coming from us. So we need to be able, for that Ta'Varen sentiment on Branagh, we need to let the teams go off and be like, oh, wouldn't it be really cool if their houses look like this, or maybe they've evolved this way, to give them the breath to be able to add some of their personality and their vision to the game. So yeah, there's also just giving that little bit of scope to kind of put people in the right direction, and then let them also help tell the story.
Yeah, the Galderine also is a good example too, because it's like yes, we could have sat there when we came up with the name, been like, all right, it's a 8-legged lizard-like thing that has huge claws and massive teeth and a stinger tail and all that stuff, which would be fine. But it's we kind of intentionally keep that stuff vague, because once we have a creature designer, an artist or designer who are starting to actually build that creature, we want them to have the freedom to be able to do what it is they want to do and satisfy whatever gameplay needs they need to have, or combat things if it's supposed to be an enemy type animal or something like that. And if we outline exactly all of these things, we create an expectation that it is all of these things, then they don't have as much freedom down the road to make it feel as fun or interesting or cool as it can be. So yeah, we try to.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you really kind of handcuff yourself, if you're getting everything too much, like that's exactly what Jared was saying. You don't want to have everything just really, really locked in, and then if something kind of doesn't work, or if a design element is thinks something else would be cooler, or something in gameplay affects it, right? Like that's like a huge part of this is like that this universe is a living, breathing kind of a thing, even in alpha to some degree, right? So it's like, you know, it reacts and it does these things. So and I think that's always been the idea with Star Citizen. Also, like mystery, a bit of mystery is kind of fun because it's like stokes the imagination, right? Like it's like, you know, in Star Wars to me gets less and less interesting the more stuff we know specifically about it, you know, and like and that's why, you know, the original stuff is cool because it kind of throws out all these vague ideas that really stoke your imagination, and you see things and you hear terms that don't necessarily have context, and not everything would, right? In a real world, like you would hear people talk about animals that you don't necessarily, oh, I've never seen that animal before, I wonder what it looks like, you know, or whatever. And I think that's really kind of fun, and some things we may never describe, right? You may never see one of these things out there in the wild. It could just be something that exists in, you know, somewhere off on a planet you'll never see or whatever. And I think there's having little pockets of that stuff that makes the universe feel bigger, and also does just kind of stoke the imagination.
Possibilities, leaving things open to possibilities, leaving things open to the better idea down the road is essential in your development. And it's actually one of my favorite hallmarks of Star Citizen's development. We don't just nail everything down and force everybody into a single track. It's you know, because as the team grows, new people come in, new ideas come in with those new people, and oftentimes they can be better than what we would have come up with earlier. So it's always a good idea to leave things as loose and as open to possibility as possible. We've got a bunch of questions here from the chat here that are more like process oriented, like how you guys work. So let's go into that area here. Let's start off broad here. What is the current role of the lore team, or the narrative team, as it relates to Star Citizen and Squadron 42's development? Do you spend time just creating missions, writing stories, developing scripts or storylines for Squadron 42 and its sequels? Like how? Describe how your team works within the project, I guess.
Well, it's a lot of naps. Yeah, I mean, I guess to break, I mean, each of those games have vastly different requirements as far as what we do on them. I mean, with Squadron, you know, the storyline is a lot more locked down, just as far as like what the missions are going to be doing. So it's just basically kind of helping the teams as they're building on them and iterating on them, and you know, we'll do reviews as levels are coming along and go, does this need additional content? How does it feel with the existing dialogue? You know, has the mission changed where we have to showcase a new thing that the player needs to do that maybe wasn't captured in the original line set, stuff like that. So it can be a bit more of support stuff for that. It's basically kind of be on hand to help with whatever's needed, you know, whatever team is working on whatever facet of the game they are at that particular time. Star Citizen is the Persistent Universe is a bit more of an open thing. You know, we'll work with the mission team when they're developing new mission types. You know, sit extensively with them as they're figuring out like what are the line triggers or the events in the mission flow, basically, to figure out like when we need to have a line, when we don't. Writing mission text. We've alluded to it earlier, the item name description, all that stuff. And then we're even working with the sort of AI team as they're working on behaviors, kind of similar to what we're doing with the mission team, where like, you know, if we need to have dialogue, what dialogue requirements do these characters have, what makes sense, you know, what feels like too much or too little. So and then, you know, that's just the active development stuff. There's also developing the universe, you know, so we're still working with Britain on languages, iterating on those. Anyone else jump in, you can start throwing in tasks. We've got a bunch.
I love that you're even involved with things like graffiti. Like, you don't really think about that as being narrative driven, but like, yeah, even things as small as graffiti on the walls kind of gets run by narrative. Like, hey, does this make sense? Would this be in this area? What would it say? What would it look like? It's really interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, like as I mentioned before too, like we obviously interface with like teams that narrative teams don't traditionally interface with a lot, like marketing and sales, right? Like those are, you know, I mean, those are because of the unique nature of the way Star Citizen started and the way that like a lot of our marketing initiatives are sort of baked into this like in lore kind of, you know, sort of semi-diegetic. They walk a fun line there, which we've been able to have some fun with over the years. And because of that, like there is a heavy narrative element to a lot of the marketing stuff. So like we said, and even the big things that like cross the line, like Intergalactic Aerospace Expo or Invictus Launch Week, where it's like technically a marketing thing, but then it has this big in-game element that you can go and like interact with and stuff, right? Which is pretty neat and like pretty different than like a lot of other live service games or whatever you want to call them out there, So it's like, and because it is very narratively focused, it's not just the marketing thing that's like sort of divorced from the lore and the larger storyline.
Yeah, and as a narrative team, we're somehow both an upstream and a downstream team, so we can be involved on either side or both sides of a task. And when it comes to managing all that, having Blythe be around and be able to track everything and run down people and be able to say no at certain points is so vital to the process, because again, it's such a wide world and we are looped into so many things. So all her hard work and being able to track everything internally is just a job in and of itself on a whole other level, which blew my mind.
Yeah, one of the neat things that I've observed here, and the reason why one of the reasons I liked interacting with your team so much, is that everything hits narrative at some point. If it's not at the beginning, it's definitely 5 minutes before the end, at least. But everything we do touches narrative at some point. It always comes back to story in one way or another. And sometimes that can be reverse engineering, like we really want to do this thing, and now we need to find a way for it to fit within the universe. And then other times we want to do something, but we don't know what we want to do, and then narrative is that spark that starts the flame kind of thing. But it is, as Mike said, it's really important here that everything work from a story perspective. And it's one of my favorite aspects of working here at CIG. That said, the next question leads into this here. How close does the lore influence gameplay in Star Citizen? Should the things we read about be indicative of things we as players will eventually be able to do in-game? Who wants to touch this? I think it's going to be you, Dave.
I mean, again, in the early days of the project, we would use that sort of the vagueness. We were trying to, it was, with our dispatches, we were doing a lot more stories back then, as well as the news updates and stuff like that. And the idea was that it was trying to capture kind of the sense of what it was going to be like in the universe. That being said, we made a very conscious effort to not, kind of what we're talking about with the animals, like get very specific about stuff. So usually as far as how much lore influences gameplay and stuff like that, usually the lore starts as a launching place for the gameplay, so they can kind of go, what's sort of established, what's the kind of the rough vibe of it. But back in the day, like we would have Tavaran characters in stories, but we never described what we maybe would make a light allusion to a physical feature of them or characteristic, but we never were like, they're 6 feet tall, blah blah blah, they have 85 tentacles, none of that stuff, because again, it was about kind of capturing the feeling of it more than the nuts and bolts of it. So again, the lore would usually work as kind of a launching pad to start discussions about new things, but at the same time, it still tries to be flexible enough where, if there's a gameplay reason to do something, they're not inhibited by lore. So it's kind of a give and take. So it depends on the situation, but yeah.
Go ahead.
No.
Okay. I think lore is a lot like concept art. In a way, it's a fantastic exploration of ideas. It's a fantastic fleshing out of this is how this can work. This is how this is a jumping off point for the game designers, for the artists and stuff to leap from. And sometimes it's a 1-1. Sometimes it's what you develop in lore ends up exactly in game, or 99% in game, just like it matches with the concept art, and then sometimes it deviates quite a bit. You know, look at how many variations the Freelancer went through before we finally ended up where we were at. So I don't think there's any hard rule. I think that's one of the reasons you struggle with answering that question, because there isn't just a hard and fast, this is how it always is.
Yeah.
It's where it works, yes.
And also the thing too, like you'll notice too in our stories and fiction that we'll get more specific once the gameplay has come out, because then it becomes a little bit more locked down. So then we can kind of talk about kind of nuts and bolts stuff and have it factor a little bit more into the storyline. But again, you know, to use the sculpting sketching analogy, like initially the lore is that kind of rough shape of it's vaguely kind of meant to be like this, but it's still flexible enough where you're not locked into a specific form, and so you can make adjustments. Is usually the approach we try to take. But yeah, like Jared said, sometimes it can be, you know, the gameplay kind of lines up perfectly with what we've established, and sometimes we'll have to kind of go back and go, all right, well, how can we sort of retcon the lore to fit with how the experience is actually going to be? Because ultimately that's kind of the thing, is that this is something that people are going to be playing and doing. So
yeah, when you create so much you know, dense lore, again, ahead, like you said, at early days before, you know, there was a lot of gameplay out there, you know, clearly, like with all this stuff, with everything, things are gonna change, right? I mean, as gameplay concessions are taken into account, and as people get in there and actually start playing it and see what's fun and what's not fun and whatever, you know, I mean, all that stuff is gonna change, right? So I think it's a fool's errand to like parse through all the lore and be like, well, in this thing they put a data card in this one machine and you can't do that in game, and that's weird. It's like, okay, like don't do that, you know, don't nitpick every little aspect of a thing, but yeah,
and
clearly.
If you do send all those complaints to Mike Kinsella,
That's true, yes.
Directly, yeah.
Please complain to me.
Yeah.
But I think, yeah, I think it's very malleable. But I like the concept art. I never really thought of it that way, Jared. But I like that analogy. It's kind of cool. And like Dave was saying, it's kind of like the first sketches of it, right? Or early on, are more vague and more like it might go this way, it might go that way. And as it manifests in game, you can kind of narrow it down until you've got like lore and stuff that matches really, like you said, one-to-one, as opposed to being more of a concept.
One last process question, then we'll get back into like the lore specific questions. How does the lore team tackle the enormous amount of work for the Star Citizen universe? Planets, colonies, cities, food, people, clothes. What do you want to offer us, Blythe?
Very carefully. Yeah, it is a lot of work. There's Dave is in meetings like 12 hours a day, so I don't know how he writes anything outside of that, but he still does. It's fascinating. But there are a lot of meetings that we're involved in, which is really cool. And so, you know, we kind of track in those meetings what's needed from us, when it's needed. And then, of course, we have a system. This is all very boring, I'm sure, but we have a ticketing system where, you know, we track all of our work in there, and, you know, we figure out when is it due, when is it needed in the game, all these things. And then we create our priorities based on all of that. And that's just a matter of going through all those tickets and figuring out, like, who can do this, when are they going to have time to do it, all those things, and then just planning appropriately. And that's pretty much a producer's job, just figuring out what you can do and when, and just trying to wrangle as much as you can, because there's just so much all the time. And, you know, we do our best to get as much done as possible and hope that the community loves it.
No, and Dave won't bring it up, but Dave also is out there directing things like PCAP shoots and stuff from time to time. Like when we were just out there in Europe last week or the week before, you were out there working for pickups with the female player character for Squadron 42. So
yes, it's true.
A very busy person. Very busy person.
Good hamburgers.
We did have good hamburgers, but we walked all over town before we got there for. Let's see. All right, so back to some lore questions. Are we expecting to see some other major lore rewrites as we did with Death of a Spaceman? Was there a major lore rewrite with Death of a Spaceman?
Yeah, the regen.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, the kind of what we were talking about before with the sort of what's the handoff between, lore and gameplay and stuff like that. I mean, part of the reason why we were taking that cryptic approach and the vagueness in the beginning is to prevent us from having to retcon stuff. It kind of creates a lot of a buffer and again a lot of flexibility for people to kind of design within that. But again, occasionally, what something comes up where we have to retcon it, but the hope is that we keep that to a minimum because and actually, to be fair, the regen thing actually isn't necessarily a retcon because it develops in sort of real time. So we wouldn't go back and say there was always this tech. This tech sort of was unveiled, 6 months ago or whenever it was, in the universe. So it's kind of a new thing. So I mean, Adam wrote that great Far From Home story about old Jagger trying to reconcile the notion of being, of regen technology. What does that mean for a person and their sense of identity and their soul and like kind of big, heady questions, which is really cool. And so, yeah, being able to have characters within the universe reacting to that dynamically has actually been a lot of fun. But again, hopefully, there's never a situation where it's like, oh, there are dragons now, like, that type of thing where it has to be a massive pivot. But so we definitely want to try to keep that stuff to an absolute minimum, just so people don't have to kind of relearn the set.
And if you do want dragons in Star Citizen, go to Twitter and tag John Crew.
It's specifically for rideable dragons, right?
Just I'm going to escalate this till neither one of us can ever use our Twitter ever again. Speaking of the hard questions, since Banu-style slaving and indentured servitude is part of the Banu culture, and the Banu are allies with the UEE, does that mean that the Slaver Suli is allowed to transport product through UEE space to North Banu space and along the southern UEE regions bordering Banu space? Come on, Adam.
Yeah, do it, Adam. It's all you.
Oh, thank you. That's a very detailed, interesting question, and I think something where there could be a lot of interesting, cool gameplay thing because, I'm going to assume that those type of contracts would violate the UE common laws, which UE systems are supposed to uphold. But as you've seen in Stanton, UE laws aren't always being completely upheld where they are. So certain Banu ships may be able to travel through certain parts of systems and, maybe not run into any interference, but they could be big problems if they do. It's going to be an interesting cultural question going forward, and I think that'll be, it's also going to be the same with the Xi'an, as there's a Xi'an system in particular that is essentially run by gangs, and when humans pass through, it's like, what's going on here? Why aren't the Xi'an doing anything about this? Until you realize that in Xi'an culture, they've essentially authorized certain gangs to operate within that system. So as a Xi'an, there's going to be these cultural differences where from a UE perspective, it's like, that's not right, that's not how we do things, but Xi'an space is different and they handle it certain ways, and instead of saying all gangs are bad, they say, all right, you few gangs, go ahead, you just do all your stuff here and we'll leave you alone. So I think that's what's going to be really cool and interesting for the players to kind of go out there and experience and see what happens when they kind of brush up against these different cultures and different ways of approaching things. So of course we don't want to get lock ourselves into something quite yet, but just by bringing up the question itself, you're realizing the possibilities and the storytelling and game playing potential that comes from these kind of like fringe systems or just differences between the species in game.
And it might be one of those things too, where it's the based on whatever the interstellar trade accord that the humans worked out with the Banu, that maybe it's the question specifically kind of called out the slave Suli, like maybe they're not allowed to do business inside UEE space because it does violate the common laws and that type of thing. So maybe they don't venture into UEE space and they kind of stay in Banu territory and stuff like that. So yeah, there's a lot of opportunities for us to kind of play with that because yeah, it raises really weird, difficult questions from the UEE's perspective of how do they deal with, that facet of Banu culture that they certainly don't agree with. So.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a great question. I mean, it's a great just thing to bring up because it brings up all these, like, it's sort of like we were saying, we spark, the lore sparks things in y'all and y'all spark things in the lore sometimes. So it's like, it's like nice to like throw it back once in a while. It's like, oh yeah, how would I thought of that, like, yeah, how would they deal with that? Like, it's an interesting question, like an interesting sort of political, economic question for the future.
And I'm willing to bet that when the time comes, that question needs to be addressed, when we've got Banu ships flying through and multiple systems like that. I'm willing to bet that people on the lore team will have differing opinions, and it will be interesting to see where that lands. Is there a consistent storyline or overarching theme the team is working towards for the game lore, or is the approach a lot more granular, or on an event base or case-to-case base, or this might be the kind of Roman influence, maybe? Is that what they're talking about there? I'm not sure. Is there a consistent storyline and overarching theme to the entire Persistent universe?
I mean, yes, there's ultimately going to be one. I mean, again, right now we're sort of, as we kind of talked about it earlier with the one of the earlier questions, we're still building the foundational mission stuff. So sort of the expectation is that once that's kind of in place, we can start enacting these sort of larger narrative things. But no spoilers, but like the conversation has been going on of like, because we're live, when do we want to start introducing these larger things? And we've been doing it with in the Xenothreat stuff in Santon and alluding to it in some of the dialogue for other stuff. And so there are definitely threads that we've been laying down. It's just a question of like kind of when we want to start moving that progression forward is sort of the question at the moment. So, but yes, the hope is that, I mean, again, there will be sort of there's a large thematic conceit that's sort of guiding the universe. But again, this is the system